Every February in the United States, Black History Month is observed, and it's used to celebrate, educate, and remind people of the accomplishments of Black Americans. People like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks spring to mind, but a name that may not be as known is Malcolm Little, and that's easy to understand, as Malcolm Little didn't go by that name in the public eye. Instead, he chose the name Malcolm X. Now, single-letter surnames aren't as uncommon as you might think at first. From my research, single-letter surnames appear most in East Asia, but Malcolm X wasn't from China, or Korea, or Vietnam. In fact, he was born in Nebraska. So why did Malcolm Little use the name Malcolm X? I guess first off we should look into the life of Malcolm X a little bit more. As I said, he was born in Nebraska on the 19th of May 1925 to Louise and Earl Little. Their family faced a lot of harassment, exposing Malcolm Little to racism at a very young age. From their house burning down and the fire and police force doing nothing to stop it, to his father being found dead with the police not investigating the case, chalking it up to an accident. This death of her husband left Malcolm's mother in shock, leading her to be committed to a mental institution, and in doing so, separating Malcolm from his siblings into various foster homes. In school, he excelled academically, but despite this, one of his teachers told him that wishing to be a lawyer was just unrealistic for him. Malcolm dropped out of school at just 15 years old, which turned him to a life of crime and his eventual arrest in 1946. He read constantly in prison, and he was visited by siblings who had joined the Nation of Islam, who were a small section of African American Muslims who felt that Black Americans needed to have their own separate state away from white Americans. He converted to the Nation of Islam while still in prison, and once a free man again in 1952, he became a key player in the Nation of Islam. Malcolm had an innate skill in speech. He was a gifted orator, and from his previous life experiences, he used his voice to discuss the issues facing African Americans, how they needed to be free from racism by any means necessary, as he put it. This included the use of violence. This of course juxtaposed greatly with the views of another civil rights leader of the time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who believed in peaceful protest and races of people being able to integrate, live and work in society together. King's and X's philosophies attracted different people, those who wished to peacefully end racism in America, and those who wanted to rise above white Americans and be the superior race. African American historian James H. Cone said on the matter, "Those two people, Martin and Malcolm, symbolize something that is in all African Americans. Each of us has a little bit of Martin and a little bit of Malcolm in us. Malcolm represents that blackness in us, that sense that we don't want white people messing with us. Malcolm represents that fire, that fight that refuses to let anybody define who we are. King represents our desire to get along with everybody, including whites, our desire to want to create a society for all people, defined by non-violence, love and care for all people in the society." By 1964, Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam due to continuing disputes with the nation's leader Elijah Muhammad. It was after leaving the Nation of Islam that he took a trip across North Africa and the Middle East, even taking the traditional Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. He realised the place the American civil rights movement took in the wider world and with what was happening across the globe at the time. He converted to traditional Sunni Muslim and changed his name to El Hajj Malik El Shabazz. After this, Malcolm returned to the States with a less angry and more peaceful mind view, excited about the ideas of a peaceful resolution to the race problems facing America. It was in the midst of this ideological shift, however, that Malcolm's life came to an end when on the 21st of February 1965, he was shot on stage when delivering a speech in Manhattan. This was just the briefest of overviews on the life of Malcolm X, his ideas and the kind of person he was. But of course there's one specific thing we are really here to look at, that being the surname of X. Why just X? X is a really interesting letter in the Latin alphabet. It's a letter that carries a lot of symbolism and meaning. It carries a lot of negative connotations with it. We use an X to show when things are wrong and incorrect. However, it also represents the unknown. X represents the unknown number of algebra. It can be used as a placeholder for a word in a phrase. A common name for a mysterious unknown character is of course Mr. X. X is just a very mysterious letter that has come to be associated with intrigue and the unknown, and it was the unknowing quality of X that Malcolm X was drawn to. As we said, Malcolm X's original surname was Little, and he was not a fan of this surname. This is something I looked into in my African American names video, but a lot of surnames of African Americans have roots in the slave trade. People brought over from Africa and sold off to slavery were given the same surname as their slave owner. Once freed, they could take on new names, as some did, but others kept on the surnames given to them by their owners. Little was one of these surnames that was a remnant of slavery in America. Malcolm took anger with this, that he still carried the name that was forced upon his ancestors due to slavery. He said that the name was something the white slave master had imposed upon his parental forebears. He dropped it and replaced it with just a single X, a an X that represents his own unknown heritage in Africa that was lost in the slave trade. Malcolm X is an interesting character from history. He is somewhat polarizing due to his more radical approach to civil rights when compared to his contemporary Martin Luther King Jr. He is often remembered for just his more radical ideologies while a member of the Nation of Islam, which I must stress is a different thing to just the religion of Islam, and it is often forgotten that he started to have more peaceful views on civil rights before his life was cut short. In 2018, one of his daughters said that we finally have the opportunity to hear directly from our father's mouth in relation to a new documentary on Malcolm X. This new documentary, named The Lost Tapes, is compiled with footage from across his life and shows more aspects to who he was as opposed to just the radical rabble-rouser he has been stereotyped as. David Royal played a role in this documentary and spoke on Malcolm X. This was a person who was on a journey, and you may criticise various stages of that journey, but where he was heading was really interesting and very important. Even though he was born Malcolm Little and died as El Haj Malik El Shabazz, it's the name he took on and rose to prominence with that he will always be remembered by: Malcolm X. Name Explained depends on awesome people like yourself to donate just a small amount on a monthly basis to help keep the channel running, so a huge thank you to all my patrons who do so. It doesn't cost much to help the channel, just $2 a month helps out in a huge way. It gets you weekly patron rewards and gets your name here with all these awesome people. Thank you.